First artist.
Yes.
Our artist talks.
Terrific.
So.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that was the introduction? Oh, okay.
That's
Oh, okay.
short one, isn't it? Maybe you'll say a little bit more about yourself.
Right, I will. I like to talk about myself. Do we need more chairs, or do we want to... Everyone's comfortable?
Go ahead and start. We'll get it.
Okay. I'll start with the formalities. Oklama Klehwetua Rodney Nuchanaflat Naniaksu Yuthul Aksuk Ukwata Hakum Annie Watts Naniaksu Hupacheset Hatwet Dan Watts. My name is Klehwetua Rodney Sayers. I am from a sovereign nation of people known as the Hupacheset. My grandmother was a chief from Ucluelet. In English you might say queen. She was a female, but she was a chief. My grandfather was the hereditary chief of Hupacheset. Now, just to clarify, in case anyone's not clear, sometimes when you hear on the radio they say chief so-and-so, it could be that they are a chief counselor. The media likes to call everybody a chief. So my elders always told me everyone wants to be the chief, but nobody wants to do any of the work. So I want to thank the Salish people. I'm on their land. Acknowledge that I'm here on their territory. Thank the SNAP people for having me here, all their hard work, all the directors and coordinators, sponsors and patrons. Kaylee, who's been amazing. I keep telling them they should promote her to president or whatever you go. My partner Emily, my biggest fan and harshest critic, second only to Matt Stevich, who is there. And of course, to all of the artists who I have the pleasure and honor of participating with. And in my art practice, I will say, if it's not fun, I don't want to do it. So I'm having fun, and I hope that I can keep you entertained today. I don't want to over-intellectualize my presentation because for me this is second nature to think about what it is that I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And one of my wise teachers told me that I have to fully understand and realize what is it that informs my work? What is that makes me think about what it is I'm doing and why I'm going to do it? So, and another equally wise teacher also said that language circles art. He said, don't kid yourself to think that your art can speak for itself. He goes, we talk about people say, well, I don't need to talk about my art because it can, it speaks for itself. It's like, well, maybe Gerhard Richter. I know there's a few artists that maybe that is true, but I think it's important, and I think it's fun. I get to stand up here and talk about myself and keep you entertained. I'm just going to go through my main ideas. I have many bodies of work, half a dozen at least, that I'm working on currently, including a collaborative body of work that I have with my partner Emily. We're called Search and Research because we're always searching and researching. We've done several bodies of work in the recent past. I'm an abstract minimalist. I do screen printing. I do language preservation work. I work politically in my community. I'm also a fisherman in the sockeye season. So I think all these things encompass my art practice and a lot of what informs my art practice and why it is that I make the things that I do. So. As I say, if anyone's got a question, I talk about this stuff a lot, I think about it a lot, and sometimes I just assume that everybody knows what I'm talking about. But I understand that isn't always the case, and sometimes I talk fast, or sometimes, my mind wanders. So if I'm not being clear or making any sense, just put your hand up, and I'm hopeful this can be casual. I don't want to, like I said, I don't want this to be formal or stuffy, and I don't want to bore you to death, because I think it's interesting. I always like to start off with a story, but I also, Matt, my good friend Matt Stevich said, well, you got to start off with a joke, which I won't do, but I do want you to know that I do have a long and storied relationship with Salt Spring Island, going way back to my first visit here to Matt Stevich's home in the early 90s. And when I called him to tell him, I didn't tell him ahead of time that I had submitted to SNAP, because I didn't know he had any influence. I didn't want to influence the outcome, but not that that was possible. But and so I called him to tell him I got in. I called him and I said, "Hey Matt, this SNAP thing, I got the word back from the committee." He goes, "Oh, sorry, man." I said, "No, I got in." He's like, "What?" He goes, "How did you do that?" I said, "I don't know, hard work." And then I sent him a photo of the image, and he said, "I remember when you used to live under the bridge and I'd come and visit you." And I said, "Yeah, I do remember that too. And that time you came down and I asked you for $20, and you wouldn't give it to me. But you left me some cat food, and I don't have a cat." Anyways, that story's not true, but we did have that conversation. So I do have a long history of Salt Spring Island, and we do enjoy coming here. And just so you know that I'm not a total interloper here. This is my grandfather, the late Hutworth, Tai Hutworth Dan Watts. And I like to tell this story because it quite fascinates me and envelops a lot of the ideas that I talk about. And this photo was taken about 100 years ago. This is 2019 now, so yeah, I guess 100 years ago, sometime in circa 1920. And what you're seeing here is they then call the Dominion Day Parade. And that is the then mayor of Port Alberni, whose name I don't know and have never been able to find out. And what had happened is that, Port Alberni's Dominion Day Parade, the theme was the Sons of the Valley. And so the parade was happening, and then my grandfather got word, and they said, "Hey, you know, the city's having a parade on Dominion Day, and we haven't been invited, and not formally anyways, and it's titled Sons of the Valley." And my grandfather said, "Well, we're the Sons of the Valley. We're the sons and the daughters of the Valley, and we're going to crash the parade." So what you're seeing in the background here, this regalia, those are his dances from Klehwetua, which is an ancient dance society. And that's his intellectual property. That's his regalia. Those we call them hinkeets, which are the headdresses. Hinkeetsum would be plural. That's his intellectual property. And with those hinkeets belong songs and dances that are his property. And when he performs them, the other chiefs, the other families will know, hey, well, that belongs to Quichinum, Dan Watts. And so, and there was a time, and I see this guy hiding here. I suspect that that's his head man. And if that's the case, he's number one. He ranks even higher than my grandfather. And he is the judge, jury, and executioner of the Klehwetua. So even the chiefs had their advisors. These people were his advisors, his historians, his keepers. They would be experts in forestry, fishery, everything that encompassed the resources of his hahutli, which would be his traditional territory. And he would be responsible for overseeing the care of all of the resources and all of the people. So what he's doing is showing his wealth. And he came out and he said, we're the sons of the valley. And this is the mayor of Port Alberni saying, this man is correct. He goes, these people, we're on their land. This is their valley. They are the sons and the daughters of the valley. So he's the mayor is making a correction, which was a really quite an amazing thing for that time. And this is an early act of reconciliation, where they were acknowledging early acknowledgement of the fact that of Aboriginal title, and that my grandfather and his people were the rightful occupiers of the land. And I had another thought, but it's gone. I'll just move on. And the other thing I was going to mention, he was also negotiating land claims in 1919. So 100 years later, we're still doing it. And so I was present at a dinner where one of the government officials was retiring from the land claims portfolio, and they all gave him a big round of applause. Like, great job. I'm going, but you didn't finish. And I also just want to add that this regalia that you see, those are sea serpents, similar to the one that I have on display here. But this is ceremonial regalia, and it's much different than an artist making artwork, maybe using those themes. It's believed that this regalia has a life of its own, and that it has a spirit, and when the dancers start dancing, that the spirit of the serpent embodies the dancer, and then the sea serpent spirit takes over, and that drives the dance. So we would call that intellectual property today. So that's very different than contemporary art, or what we call contemporary art. And my talk is called Traditional Art in a Contemporary World. I talk about that because it's what's been presented to me. When I got into art school, I didn't, I just one day decided I want to go to art school. I didn't know why. I wasn't really an artist, but I felt that it was important for me to do something to make a contribution, and to be a better communicator, to give something back to my ancestors who had worked so hard. And that was really the only reason. And I thought, well, obviously art is what I should do if that's what I want to do. So I'm talking about traditional art in a contemporary world. I think it's a lot of ideas that have been imposed upon me, or questions that were imposed upon me when I was in art school, and I didn't really have a good answer. I didn't know, how to make the argument that I should be able to make artwork the way I want to make it, because I've been given the background from my teachings as to how to proceed forward, take these ideas and do something else. So when I finally got to my undergraduate at the Alberta College of Art and Design, which it was called then, and now it's called something else, the University of the Arts of Alberta or something, I had the fortune to work with a man named Charles Lutenbrain. And for the first 2 years of my practice there, and other teachers, I was fortunate to work with some really amazing people for my 2 years at Capilano University and then the ACAD. But my whole first 2 years there, I didn't use any of the traditional motifs. I didn't do any of this. I said, I want to be a native artist. I want to be an artist. And they were like, well, you can't really separate the two. And so Charles begged me, says, please, he goes, do something, use your traditional motifs. You have such a rich history and a background. Please take advantage of it. He says, people would kill to have what you have. I'm like, okay. I said, but if I'm going to do it, I got to find a different way of approaching it, because I'm not going to do what a lot of artists on the West Coast are doing. And it wasn't a criticism. So I'm not going to carve into silver, because that's being done, and they're really accomplished people, and I could never be better than them anyways. So we devised a system of creating imagery by building layers. This is I did this postgraduate, but undergrad. But this is actually 2 sheets of metal, so all the imagery on the front was actually pierced out of the first sheet of metal, and the background was chased. And I came up with this idea of I wanted the back of the bracelet to be marked as I was marking the front of the bracelet. So there's a ghost image on the back of it, and I brought in color and gold and gem settings. So that's how I solved that problem. Is that okay? I'm working in a traditional themes, traditional motifs, traditional ideas, but I found my own way of doing it. So that was important to me. And the reason I'm talking about all this is because it's going to get me to where I am today. And if I'm talking too fast or none of it's making sense. But as I was working along, this is a piece I did for the Winter Games in 2009. This is Flight, Flow, and Fusion. It was the motif. It was the theme for the Richmond Skating Oval. But as I was going along, people were really challenging me. I'd be showing my work to gallerists. Not Matt, he always accepted me for what I was. I had to give him credit for that. But Benny Gauss is like, well, that's contemporary. That's not First Nations arts. Go talk to a contemporary gallery. So I'd go show Derek Simpkins and Leona Latimer and some of the heavies in Vancouver. They're like, oh, that's contemporary. That's not native art. So they didn't really want to talk to me. But it was just, again, it was just. It didn't drive me, but it was sort of like a challenge. It was like, just spurred me on to keep doing what I was doing, because I must be doing it right if someone's telling me that I was wrong. So, and the other thing I found out when I went and studied jewelry at the ACAD, because I applied on a sculpture portfolio, and they sent my application upstairs to jewelry, and then I got a phone call saying, you can't come and study sculpture, but do you want to come and study jewelry? So I said, sure, why not? And as it turns out, it was probably the best thing that could have happened for my practice, because it was very hand skill intensive. With jewelry, you're working in margins of 1/10 of a millimeter. So when I brought that skill to my other disciplines, it really made me see things in a different way. So. And what I started to do is I started building my own language. These markings were made by tools that I made. I have probably a dozen or more chasing tools to make the pattern markings, and so what I was doing really was building my own vocabulary, so visual vocabulary, and I was banking it and using it later on. So and this idea of these deep figures, these deep cuts, was based on Bill Reed and his idea of deep carving or well made. And Charles Edenshaw, who somehow was credited with inventing the Northwest jewelry tradition. So, and it was just like, well, how did it go from here into carving into metal, and then it becomes traditional, and I'm bringing it somewhere else, and it's not traditional anymore. So that was really questions that fascinated me, and what I came to argue is that, well, who gets to decide what traditions are, and is it the ethnographers, is it the historians, the art collectors, or the dealers? And I thought, no, it's the artists. The artists get to decide what's traditional, because they're the ones doing it. So and of course there are guidelines. It's not a free-for-all. Obviously I'm still respecting the guidelines of where the tradition came from, because that's what informs my work. So here it is. So when I ventured into the realm of carving, and much like the jewelry world that was dominated by guilds and apprentices and apprenticeships and masters and master goldsmiths and master silversmiths and master watchmakers, the jewelry world, or the carving world, much like the jewelers, they're a different breed of people. I suspect they might even be aliens from another planet, but and I don't consider myself to be a carver. I'm a sculptor. If we want to make that argument, that's the argument I'm making. If you want to challenge me on it, that's fine. But this is basically the first thing I ever carved. Myself and a friend of mine, his name is Cecil Dawson. We carved the first figure on the right here. This is Nu Chi E. He's the mountain, and that's Hakumi. She's the princess. And these logs are 20 feet long. They were just over 5 feet in diameter when we started. And we designed these with help of the elders advisors of our community, of my community. Cecil is from the North Coast, but we brought him in to help me. So we sat down and we designed these. So this is how they wanted them to look. They wanted it to look like old, like it was carved 100 years ago. And so it was a very enlightening and challenging process. We did it in public. I don't know if everyone's ever seen this, but just on this side of that, there's a building there that it was a shelter that we carved the figures in, and it was open to the public, so the public could come down and watch us and ask us questions. And eventually we made them make us a big sign that said the top 10 questions asked about the welcome figures. But I think one of the most amusing things, because people are coming from all over the world, and one of the most common questions, believe it or not, is like, are you a real Indian? And I said, I'm Hoopachesit, and I believe Cecil is Kwakwala, or Kwakwakwiakwa. And they're like, oh, well, I never met one before. I didn't even know you existed. Like, I just saw you, like, people were coming from Europe. And it's just like, and, you know, I talked to the other carvers and say, I hate it when people ask you that. I'm going, I think it's fascinating. I think it's awesome. Like, that they have the little kids, you know, like, are you a real Indian? I said, yes, I am. And I thought I wasn't offended at all by that question. I thought it was quite fascinating, and it was like quite honored to say, yeah, I am, and we're still here, and we're still doing this. So that was the beginning of my carving career. I had never really carved anything previous to that. We jumped into it, and it was a real learning experience. These figures were raised to welcome travelers. The mountain welcomes the people traveling on land, and the princess is facing the river. She's welcoming the water travelers. And they were made to honor the chiefs. This is the property, intellectual property of the chiefs. But it was also made to lift the chiefs up, lift up the people, and lift up all the travelers who come. So they're there to honor everybody who observes them. So, and you know, working with the advisors of my community, they were fluent speakers that I worked with as well, doing language work. It was very important for them that this work get done, and that someone from their own community was actually executing it. And they're all gone now. Most of my advisors, all of my old-time chiefs, I have very few of the old-time advisors left. Everyone has passed on, and you know, they've left me to carry on this work. So,
where are those figures?
In Port Alberni, if you come down Johnson Hill, which is Highway 4, you'd run straight into them, because then it makes a sharp right-hand turn to go out to Tofino Ucluelet. But they're right at the bottom of Johnson Hill on Highway 4 in Port Alberni. So that's the Saltmass River there, and the marina is just next to it. So sort of getting to where I am today, and I want to check my time so I'm not carrying on too long. Again, you know, when I started carving, making sculptures, it took me a long time to get here, because it was like, I don't want to carve masks because everybody else is doing it. And it's like, I have to find a different way of working. So this was the first one I made. This was probably 15 years ago. And, you know, after having worked in sculpture and these, you know, taking these ideas of formal considerations, I wanted to move away from the idea of painting them, you know, in the traditional Northwest Coast style. We're actually in the Southwest, but they call us Northwest. So I wanted to get away from those color motifs of the classic reds and the greens. You know, in the New Channel, you know, we use a lot of greens and blues, and then farther up the coast, it's reds and blacks and sometimes yellows. And of course, in Haida Gwaii, the classic is red and black. But I wanted people to focus on the volume and the form, and I wanted them to look at this and look at it in a sort of a formal sculptural way, you know, from the side and underneath and the back, and so I made it solid black. That is a secret treatment underneath, and then it's finished with black shoe polish, which is sort of my comment on the carving custom on the Northwest Coast here. You see those plaques in the gift shops that are brown and black, they're all colored with shoe polish. And that's a trade secret, and don't tell anybody. But so that was sort of my commentary. It's just like this idea of creating this formal art, but you know, borrowing from those traditions, and you know, sort of changing my approach to how this work is executed. This came after, again, you know, I'm staying with the black. This is the raven. He's about yay big. I'm sort of, again, trying to create my own vocabulary, creating these, you know, understated forms, and, you know, working with those formal sculptural considerations. This is, and then again, I'm getting, you know, I'm more comfortable with what I'm doing now. You can see that they're changing, and this is the big wolf, and you know, staying with that approach of, you know, the form, sort of a format, but not really, but staying with, you know, the monotone approach, and then came this one. This stands about 6 feet tall, 6.5 feet tall. This is the raven and the bear playing Lahal, which is a gambling game. And the bear's hiding the gambling bones in his hand. And this came about because when I was working with fluent speakers, recording the history, one of my teachers, the late Nelson Keatla, talked about the tradition of Lahal on the West Coast and how it's this gambling game. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but you have a bone that's marked and one that's blank, and there's 6 sticks, and then there's the king stick, and there's this singing and carrying on, and there's this big dramatic theatric performance where the guy holding the bones, in this case it's the bear, he'd have this elaborate way of moving his arms and behind his back, and they'd be singing, and and there were people all up and down the coast who were famous for holding the bones, and chiefs would hold big feasts just in order to get a chance to play Lahal with the best on the coast, and huge fortunes would be bet and gambled on the teams, and how when the Chinese people came to Port Alberni, the Chinese people, the Chiniat, we called them, and the Nuchanathat, ate together because we were only allowed to eat in one restaurant in Port Alberni, and it was Han's Corner, which was a Chinese restaurant. So all the Nuchanat people and the Chinese people would eat together. And then there was one night at the theater where we were all allowed to go to the theater on a Thursday night. My theory is because there was too much talking, because somebody was interpreting what was being set up on the screen. They're saying, "What's he saying now? What's he saying now?" But so it was this alliance, this strange alliance with the Chinese Canadians, and they said, "Well, we like gambling too, so we want to put together a team. You think we could do that?" So people up and down the coast, Chinese people up and down the coast, and possibly Japanese, I'm not sure, put together teams. They made their own songs. Famously, Nelson sang a song when the Chinese would sing, "Naisi Mano, Naisi Mano, whoa, whoa, hey, hey, chow, chow." And Naisi is how the Chinese, or the Nuchanat people would say rice, because we don't have R's or D's in our language, so they'd say Naisi, because they couldn't say rice. So I made this to honor that history, that idea of this oral history that's really rich. So I was like, I want to make a piece to honor that idea. And one of my regrets is that I didn't sit down with Nelson and write a book about Lahal, because I've asked some Chinese Canadian friends I have in Port Alberni, and said, I never heard that before. I don't even know what you're talking about. I said, well, somebody must know, because this really happened. So yeah, this is called Kwisasef, and it means that he wants to change his hands. He wants to hide the bones in a different place. So again, it was finished in black and then polished in black shoe polish, and it's in a private collection now, so I don't get to visit it very often. This, I like to show this because it's a good story. This is the Hupukwanam. Now, Hupukwanam is the treasure box of the chiefs. So I mentioned before that the chief had this intellectual property. Well, he kept it inside a box. So whether it was the songs or the regalia or the oral history, the box of the chiefs, the Hupukwanam, represented the chief's wealth. And so I collaborated with Tim Paul. I was recruited to work with Tim, who's a master carver. He lives and works in Port Alberni. And they asked us to make a piece for the Richmond Skating Oval. So we spent months designing this work, and we had it on paper, and we had to bring it to the committee, come back, and then we made a maquette, like a little model of it. We brought it, and it went on and on and on. And but what ended up happening is that these two are called the Klama, and they are the territorial markers, and these are the sea serpents. These are my motifs. And then this is the sea, land, mountains, and then that's the sky chief up there. That's Tim Paul's work. And so it's the sea to sky Hupukwanam. So because that's the theme of the Olympic Games was the sea to sky games. So a very long story short, if I had any advice to give to any artist, this is like, make sure that in your contract it says that you have the final say over everything that you're doing. Because you can see in the background, this was intended to be clear. You were supposed to be able to see through the glass, because this is tempered glass. It's been sandblasted. Behind this framework, inside of this is a steel framework. We were going to build it out of red cedar. No, you can't do that. The engineer got involved because you can't build that out of cedar. It's got to be a steel frame. So inside there is a steel frame. So we had the steel frame and we had it. The glass was ready to install, and the engineer came over. He said, "I've been up all night thinking about this." He goes, "It's not strong enough." I'm going, "It's a steel tube. Like, it's made with angle iron. This is like it's stainless steel tube frame. This is." And then these concrete pads go down 8 feet into the ground with reinforced rebar. And so what he did was he made steel strapping go across each opening in the window for the torsional strength. So I always say that when the big earthquake hits Vancouver, this is going to be the only thing that's going to be left standing. So I say, "Oh, there's Richmond. I can see the hoop with him." But if you go there at night, it lights up. It has a lighting package in it, and it changes color. So it's like white color, and then it changes 5 times to different colors. So we were pretty happy with the end result. During the process of making that, I cut these 3 fingers almost off. Luckily, it was towards the end of the project, so it got done. And when I was at the Winter Games, Matt and John used to have a radio show. I'm not sure. So I wrote them a letter and I said, "Hey, knuckleheads." And then I wrote, because we had this taunting going on. I said, "Hey, knuckleheads." And then I talked to me. And so Matt starts reading and goes, "Hey, knuckleheads." He goes, "Well, at least we have knuckles." I've got, "Good one, Matt." I can laugh at myself even though I almost cut 3 fingers off. Anyways, we had a huge party in Vancouver, and we gifted it to the chiefs of the 3 host First Nations. So it's like and we had a big feast when we left Port Alberni because our property was leaving Port Alberni, and we gifted it. We said, now it's up to you to take care of it. So that was a real significant thing, and they invited us into their big house, and we had a big feast, and we carried on, and it was an amazing time. So this is the beginning of my hot rod work. This is the hot rod paddle number 1. Moderately successful. I'm showing it to you because this was the idea of, I have this fascination with hot rod culture. I always have as a kid. In Port Alberni, at one time was the richest town in Canada. And growing up in high school, everybody had a muscle car. Everybody had a fast car. They had hot rods, street rods, sports cars. And I was just fascinated with this whole thing. And I used to watch the NHRA, National Hot Rod Association. I used to have their magazines. I was just fascinated by this idea of these hot rods. So I sort of started fusing it into my work. I thought, well, I want to make work that had hot rods. I want to have flame licks. I want it to look really cool because I think that'll be cool. I want it to be cool. That was my only thing. It's just like I wanted it to look cool like a hot rod. So I actually designed this. I sent it away for the guy to paint it. It came back and it was horrible. So I redid it. So this was the result. So this is hot rod paddle number 1. It's my idea, was to have these creature heads with the flame licks coming off of them. But that was the only one I did. And I'll show you this now because that idea of the bright colors, and this is iridescent green. This photo doesn't really do it justice, but this is the year of the snake, done in the year of the snake, and it's a lightning snake head. And so I started bringing the colors in and changing my approach to it. So this is the first sort of movement in my carving, going away from that. Yes.
What's the medium?
This is red cedar. Red cedar and iridescent oil paint and black paint, and this is cedar rope, like woven cedar bark into rope. This is braids. It's like I say, these things are always obvious to me, and I sometimes forget to mention it. So this was my first move away from being more bold, going into the realm of mass carving. This is hot rod paddle number 4. I was working in Toronto with a friend of mine, Dean Drever, And he was having, some of his work was getting painted by Ferrari Canada, also called European Auto Body. So I said, hey, do you think they'll paint a paddle for me? And so we went there. I went there with this paddle to the European Auto Body, and there's all these 3 Italian dudes standing there, and they're saying, you think you could paint this for me? I want it to be unbelievable. I want it to look just like, I want the angels to sing when you hold it up. It's like, oh, and you're just like, oh, you're smoking cigarettes. You're very funny. And so I'm standing there, and this old guy, I guess he must have been like 70. He's been painting Ferraris for 40, 50 years, smoking a cigarette. He goes, I'll paint that myself. And off it went, and I got it back, and there it is. And it's like, it's really hard to photograph these shiny objects. I mean, this photograph doesn't do it justice. And so there it was. This was the next step.
What color is it?
It is metallic copper. And it's metallic copper because copper is a show of wealth on the northwest coast. So if you have something that's made of copper, customarily it would be showing your wealth. And sometimes you'd break a copper up and give it out as a show of wealth. So these ideas are just getting into my work because because I don't live in a vacuum. I don't think none of us live in a vacuum. So these outside influences, I'm just bringing them into my work, just as ideas. I think they're interesting. I think it's cool. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that I want to do it because it's cool, but really, I think that's an important aspect, and it's fun. And so here we are at the Serpent GT. Now, so this was the fusing of the 2 threads of the hot rod paddle, and the year of the snake. The most common question I got about this is like, why did you paint it fluorescent orange and yellow? And really my answer was, well, because that's the paint that I had on hand. And I wanted it to be slick. I wanted it, it's a hot rod, it's a GT, right, a Gran Turismo. So it's supposed to look fast, and I'm staying with that idea of just the 2 colors, and I want people to focus on the volumes. And when I was carving it, like I don't know where this motif came from, the appendages, because sea serpents have appendages on the top of their head, and and I started exaggerating the details. I wanted to go deeper and more exaggerated, but keeping things simple. Like there's no nostril carved in, and the eye isn't painted black.
Matches your outfit.
Thanks. Yeah, I just happen to have this on hand. But and again, there's this custom. Again, I want people to take pause. When I'm working with this imagery, I want people to take pause and stop and contemplate it. You could just walk past it and you may never notice it, but it's pretty hard to ignore this piece. And hopefully it gives you pause to think about, like, well, why did he do that? Like, what is that? Like, why? Like, why? And that's perfect. I think that's exactly what I want people to do, is to take pause and to contemplate, because I have a very contemplative art practice. This was the only mask that I carved this year, and it will be the only one. So and again, there's a custom in New Channel where I was taught that I have to be humble and not to boast. And you'll say, hey, Rod, well, you're a really groovy guy. But so it's like, why are you so humble? But anyways, I'm trying to be ironic. But so it's this idea of the humility. So when chiefs, families of chiefs, or any prominent people are not supposed to boast about themselves or about anything they've done. But this idea but when you go to a feast and you're listening to a chief's song, I was taught a song. I was helping a chief put on a feast, and I was helping the singers, and I was being taught this song, and they're saying, this song's talking about how this chief he's the whaling chief, and that there's 7 whales on the beach that he's hunted, and that was an amazing feat for any whaler, not just this one. But he could never boast about that. But he says he's allowed to boast in a song. So he composed this song to say that, I got these 7 whales and I rule. And so it's this idea of the bravado and, and saying, okay, this, like I'm boasting about this work, in a humble way. So, but I want to lift people up. I want people to see this work, and I want them to be lifted up. I want to lift up the other artists that are here, and the viewers, and I want to lift up the carving tradition. It's my work has very mixed reviews among carvers in Port Alberni or just anywhere. But I guess that's good. I mean, I like that. I mean, I think it's, if people are thinking about it, that's good. And no such thing as bad press, right? That's sort of where this came along, in that idea. And, the next one's going to be more ambitious. So I'm getting ready, for SNAP 2021. I'm almost out of time. I didn't know I was talking so long, but I just want to quickly touch on this. This is in my studio right now. This is a dugout canoe, but it's made in a wood strip method. So I don't know if anybody knows wood stripping. You can see the bands here that the form of this canoe is made on an upside down skeleton form. So this was actually made upside down, and they're like ribs of a human. And the bow and the fore and the stern are from a New Channel dugout. So I copied the forms of a New Channel dugout, and I fused it together with the, I guess, European wood stripping method. So this canoe is made from strips of wood that are 1/4 inch thick by 1 inch wide over this mold. And when it's all stripped out, you tear the whole thing up and turn it over, and that gives you the hull of the canoe. That might not be a very good description, but it's a long and involved process. So I'm just in the process of trimming it out. So this was an idea, and I did it this way because I wanted it to be sculptural. Like, I didn't want to make a dugout again because it's way out of my league. It would take me years to learn how to carve a dugout. But I wanted to honor the form because I think the form is so beautiful and it's so sculptural, and I wanted to make it and exaggerate it, make it sleeker and faster, and like the $6 million man. I wanted it to be better, but it's not better. It's just different. And it is finished with fiberglass cloth and epoxy resin to make it strong. And the way it sits right now, it probably weighs about 100 pounds. And that's a 17-foot hull. If that was a dugout, it would probably weigh thousands of pounds. So one person could lift that up and paddle it. And this canoe was made from 2 pieces of red cedar that was 2 inches thick, 12 inches wide, and 20 feet long. So, and it was this idea that I had about sustainability and utilizing the material in a smart way. And it wasn't meant to criticize the art of making a dugout. It was about thinking of different ways of working and being sustainable, and making it, because we could make 1,000 canoes out of one tree, and then everybody could have one. What's going to happen is that this is going to be painted like a hot rod. Right now, I found someone to do it. He's an amazing painter. But yeah, this is going to, there's going to be the big wolf's head up here or something, and then the flameless are going to go down the side. But it's going to be painted, black. It's going to be hot rod black, metallic black, and it'll be trimmed out with some of my paddles. That's what I'm working on right now. Among other things, I have 2 20-foot logs in my shop as well that I'm hoping to carve soon. And I have a smaller log that I'm going to be carving the maquette that I'm going to use to carve the 20-foot poles. And that's a whole other story. I wish I had time to tell you about that. But I will leave it there because I want to leave a few minutes for questions. But anyways, I guess, my work is really about shaping my world, or shaping our world, and lifting people up, lifting up their spirits. And one of the most important things that my fluent speakers and elder advisors and my chiefs always impressed upon me is that when I talked to them about my work and what I was doing, and they'd think about it for a long time, and they'd say, "Okay, I think I get it." But they say, but the most important thing that you do is to keep doing this work because you have to remind people that we are still here. And so I want to thank you all for coming. It's so important that you all come out and listen to me talk. I hope I made sense and maybe it was interesting. And I could talk for hours about this work. Like I say, this is like 1/10 of my body of work that I've talked about today. But thank you for coming out and thanks for this opportunity. I love a good challenge, and that's why I participated in the SNAP, because it's like, it sounds like such a great challenge, and it sounds like it's going to be fun, and hopefully meet some cool people, and I have, and it's such an amazing opportunity and a gift to be here. And this says Klehwetua, which means thank you in our Nuu-chah-nulth language and in our font. So I probably forgot a bunch of stuff I wanted to tell you, but I'm going to leave it at there, and thank you so much for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I got more of an observation.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
I've been dealing in Northwest Coast Art for about 27 years, and my gallery used to be called Thunderbird Gallery. So the focus of the art was Indigenous art, and mostly on the coast, but I was dealing with other arts as well. But as we moved into the 2000s, I noticed a lessening demand on the Northwest Coast art form, and it seemed to be losing favor and losing steam. And one of the reasons I attributed to it was a lack of innovation. And one thing you see, innovation in the form. The artists seem to be recreating similar pieces over and over and over again, and partly because they were trapped by the marketplace, thinking if I stray too far from tradition, this might not sell. So it was kind of a circle that fed on each other. And I always felt that that's exactly what was missing from the form, is people to step forward and say, let's go somewhere else with this. And there's probably a handful, it's literally a handful or less of artists who are doing what Rod's doing, which is, as he touched on earlier, saying, I wanted to see myself as an artist first, not an Indian artist. That's where I want to see myself. And I think this is a classic example of that approach. He was able to draw from his heritage, but who does hot rod, native art? I've never seen it, and I don't think anyone else has, and that's exceptional. And the best comment you had there was you thought you were doing things right because everyone thought you were doing things wrong. I think that really hits it on the head. But that's just what I think. This is super exciting. What you're seeing here is a whole new approach to an old form that I haven't seen this done before. And I've been around this form a long time.
Thanks.
Well,
and Matt's always welcome to my work in his gallery. So.
Where's work in my art?
Hi.
He's right there.
Have you submitted to other exhibitions? Why did you choose SNAP?
Because you could stay at my house.
Yeah. Again, it was just the timing was right, because I watched the first two go by, and partly I just wasn't ready, and I just wasn't sure that it was my thing. But like I said, that carving had been sitting on my bench for some time, and I'd been thinking and agonizing over it. And it's just like, this deadline's coming up. It's SNAP. I think it's an interesting venue. I think it's an interesting opportunity. My friend David Garneau was on the jury last time around, so I knew about it, and Matt has talked about it over the years. So the timing was just right, and I just liked the opportunity to have a challenge, like a good challenge that was going to be fun. So there's no real deep reasons why, other than it looked like a great opportunity and a challenge and chance to meet other artists. Hi.
I'll start with saying that I had the good fortune to participate in our Quakum project, which got started after we had to try to save Grace Islet here, and Joe Wickerman headed that up, and Quakum is the name for the merganser ducks down at what First Nations called, what we would call Burgoyne Bay. And we, a year or two ago, we had this totems put up. And the night before, we were sanding them, and the plan was to oil them, and then there was going to be some paint put on. But after we oiled them, and because the sun was setting, it was like, oh, there's no need for paint. And you say you're gonna paint that canoe black. And it made me wonder, when did the paint start coming on the totems?
I think it had always been there. I mean, modern paint, obviously came, but there were natural pigments, ochres, and burning was a way. Like our canoe hulls were black because they burned the outside of them to make them smooth, and then they'd sand the fibers off. So they used to have a stick of a bundle of twigs, and they'd work the canoe hull with. Because eventually the fibers would stand up and they'd burn them off, and the hull would be black because of that. But totem carving isn't prominent in New Chanoth. We had house posts. We didn't have, it wasn't common to see tall totems in New Chanoth territory. So mostly house posts and welcoming figures. And
these were welcoming.
Oh, they were, okay.
We did.
But
you can see them if you get a chance down there.
Okay.
But I was also, this summer I saw the wonderful exhibit. It was pre-colonial Haida exhibition at the McCord Museum in Montreal. And I couldn't, it was amazing, the carving on that, but they didn't have anything about the tools. But what impressed me was that they use oleander oil.
Okay.
And it is so dark now that they're almost black. They're incredible, that oil. So are you going to oil that canoe?
It's finished with epoxy resin.
Oh.
So it's a modern hull. It's like if you see a strip kayak or a strip canoe, it's finished with fiberglass epoxy resin. So and it's funny you touch on that, because when we were carving, we were using chainsaws and different stuff, and people were like, well, those aren't traditional. And and I was doing some fine work on a friend of mine's carving, and I was carving the end grain, and I said, well, I need something that's long, razor thin, and razor sharp. So I used a razor knife. And they're like, well, and then it was like, well, that's not a traditional tool. I said, yeah, but I need a tool that's razor sharp and razor thin. So what else am I going to use? I could use a piece of obsidian, I guess, go back 100 years. But sorry, that was another question.
Your work, you mentioned sea serpents a few times. What's the culture like when you refer to a sea serpent? What is it that you think of? Like,
well, the sea serpent comes to me through my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, I spoke about earlier, and it's the property of chiefs. That's what the regalia reflects. So, like I say, that the headdresses, and they're supernatural creatures. I've had the opportunity to see one once in my lifetime. But it's the same with the Thunderbird. The Thunderbird comes from my grandfather's side of the family. So when you see a Thunderbird in my work, if it was ceremonial, I could say, well, that comes to me from my grandmother. My family has the right to display that on our regalia because it comes from my grandfather. But so I don't know if that answers your question. It's a supernatural creature, and the images of it, in ceremonial sense, belong to highborn families of chiefs. So when you see that, again, it's their identity. So when you see somebody wearing that, you go, oh, well, that person's from a family of chiefs. At least in New Chanoth, we don't have clans like other nations do. We don't have like a bear clan and eagle clan. We don't have that. We only have our wolf clan, which is the dance society. So you had to know who your relatives were, so you didn't marry your second cousin. So, sir.
You spoke about, you started speaking about intellectual property and tradition, and I really like Matt's remarks and your remarks about the way the art is moving forward. But because of your root, is a piece like this one displayed in the main hall, does it have any kind of communal approval or blessing or sanction from the chiefs, or is it an entirely personal expression of yours?
Well, I guess if you were talking to somebody else, the answer might be different. But I have the sanction to use this imagery, but it's also in a contemporary sense. It's not regalia. So, you'll see a lot of paintings are just don't know how you would describe it, day-to-day art or just contemporary art. I mean, I use that word contemporary because it's not, I guess it's the easiest word to use. I don't really know what that means. I mean, contemporary generally means not making a reference to any specific traditional media or approach. And I'll never use the word culture. You'll never hear me say culture. I don't like using that word, so that's why I'm trying to find other words to use. But yeah, I mean, if you're not making ceremonial regalia, if you're from a community that has that background, you can use it. Somebody from outside of the community, if someone who wasn't Nuchanoth, let's say, who was European or whatever, that would, and they were working obviously in a Nuchanoth vein, like approach, execution of the work, then that would be appropriation. Appropriation of imagery and or intellectual property, depending. There's it's an interesting situation in nationwide where people are borrowing heavily from other traditions, but nobody wants to say anything. So it's this idea where we're just getting traction. As First Nations art is more prominent on the national scene, that people are becoming more aware of that idea of property, intellectual property. It's an interesting time, and again, in the international scene, you always hear certain people talking in the national media, like certain artists who are always prominent, and I'll say, "Ooh, don't speak on my behalf, please." So because it's also a custom not to speak on somebody else's behalf. So if you want to talk about yourself, that's fine. I'm talking about myself and my experience and what belongs to me. So it's my family has a speaker, and he speaks on behalf of my family. So it's sort of that. It's coming around. People are. It's changing. Even since I've been in school, we've come from the dark ages of being on the mainstream, to being more into the forefront and in the mainstream of it. So the national stage, if you will, it's an interesting place, and one that I've never been very comfortable or prominent in. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm interested in what you think about appropriation, or what you see is appropriation. I guess maybe just of your art, or can it be? Is it broader for the nation, or is that what you're just saying now? We're figuring it out. Or?
Well, I think part of it is young people, people like myself. I didn't, when I started out, I had a lot to learn, because I was borrowing from the Haida. I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to make a Haida mask, and then I learned. It's like, okay, well, that doesn't belong to me, and I think it happens in writing, it happens in music, so it's. I have a lot of opinions about it. I don't really want to belabor it here, but if it doesn't belong to you, then don't use it. If it doesn't belong to your community, don't use it. If it belongs to somebody else, don't take it. There's a lot of problems even within my own community, of appropriating imagery from within. So people taking things that belong to the chiefs and using it for themselves, and they don't have the right to have it. So. There was a time that would never happen, ever. So it's it's all this, it's the fallout from the Indian Act and the extermination of tradition and language, etc., and knowledge. When they introduced elected chiefs instead of hereditary chiefs, the hereditary chiefs automatically lost traction, because suddenly someone who had no standing in the community was the political chief. And suddenly someone who had no standing in the circle of hereditary chiefs, not to say that they didn't have a place or that they weren't recognized as a member, but they didn't have access to the intellectual property. They would have to have permission from a chief. So suddenly all that became a gray area. So like I was saying before, so now when you hear them saying, oh, chief so-and-so, it's like, okay, is that chief counselor, chief executive officer, chief, or is that a hereditary chief? So it's, I was saying to Matt earlier, it's like, I don't know if it was evil genius or they just managed to screw everything up by chance, by imposing all of these, ridiculous regulations and laws on our people. So it's, a lot of it has to do with education and the loss of language and tradition. The oral history, those images of those people there, they would have thousands of years of oral history in their heads. Just quickly, my Uncle Bert, the late Uncle Bert Mack, he was a chief from Tolkwat. His mother was my sister's grandmother, or my grandmother's sister, sorry. And he said, oh, I ran into these people from Macau, Nia Bay, because they're also New Channel people. He was, I think we're related to them. So as he famously tells a story, like hours later, she was still explaining to him how he was related to those people in Nia Bay. So it's like, okay, through marriage, and then she explained, the songs and the chiefs and their families and the marriages and so on and so forth that, permeated the New Channel. So, a lot of, there are 17 nations represented in New Channel. Historically, it was more. But, we have family ties one way or another to most of the nations in the New Channel through marriage. So when my cousin asks me, how are we related? I'm going, well, your great-grandmother and my grandfather were first cousins. And they're like, oh, how does that work? Well, it's pretty easy. Like, well, you know who your first cousin is. And so, but, that used to just be common knowledge. And now you have to go ask somebody to say, well, how are we related to that family? Like, how is that possible? So we say, well, your grandmother had a half-sister who married. But to them, like I say, it was just in their heads. They just sit there and oral knowledge was just in their heads. It was quite fascinating. I say, well, that's some of that knowledge was thousands of years old. So,
is it all still there, or is it some of it lost?
Oh, much of it is lost. I mean, I like to think it's in my DNA somehow, in people's DNA. So, but. If people have to leave, I'm happy to stay behind and answer some more questions. I see people sneaking out. I don't want to keep you here as hostages or anything. I know it's after 1 o'clock, so.
Rodney,
Yes.
The first slide you showed was the mayor and your grandfather.
Yes.
How do you know what the mayor said? Was it oral history?
It's oral history. I mean, this is it's a famous photo in my family. There's many copies of it. There's actually there's other photos of the side of the truck. If you can see the other side of this truck, there's a big Union Jack and a sign that says, "We are the sons of the valley." So, yeah, it's just oral history. I mean, 100 years ago wasn't so long ago. I mean, that was in my grandparents' time. So, I mean, I'm only 50-something. And so we think that was a long time ago, which it was. We didn't have the internet and stuff like that, but yeah, it was oral history. It was just well talked about, well documented, and it's by me sharing this story, it'll live on. So I mean, I think it's a fascinating story. That's why I like to tell it. So I mean, I've told it a dozen times. I'm sure Emily knows it word for word by now. But yes.
Do you drive a hot rod?
No. Well, it was kind of, sort of. Emily has, when she retired from her teaching career at the University of Lethbridge, bought 1966 Austin Healey Sprite. And it's British Racing Green, and we bomb around Port Alberni in it. I have owned several motorcycles in the past, and I did own a minor muscle car when I was younger. But I've never had a real, full-on hot rod with the pinstripes or the flame licks or anything like that. So, not yet, anyways. But I was just telling Em, I said, well, I think I might just buy a Jag or something instead, and I don't want to buy a muscle car, just maybe a sports car. But again, I don't really care that much. It's we drive an old Subaru, and I'm just happy with that. So. And I have some T-shirts if anybody needs some Christmas presents. So I don't know if I'm allowed to sell them, but just had to throw that in there. Any? Well, thank you for coming. Like I say, if you want to talk more, I'm happy to stick around a little while.
What's on the t-shirt?
Yeah.
I have a spirit bear and a sockeye salmon motif. Okay.